Welcome back. As our world feels, well, smaller and more connected every day, that old question about how Eastern and Western thinking relate, it just keeps coming up, doesn't it?
It really does. And today, we're digging into a work that tackled this head-on almost 100 years back. Rene Guénon's East and West. We're using the Martin Lings translation here.
Right. And Guenon wasn't just comparing notes, was he? He had a pretty specific goal.
Definitely. His main aim was to really scrutinize modern Western civilization,
Yeah.
its foundations, its values, and he did that by comparing it directly to the traditions of the East.
Holding up a mirror, in a way.
Exactly. He wanted to understand the core differences, the really fundamental ones, and explore if any real connection or bridge between them was even feasible.
It's a huge question. So the book maps this out, right? He talks about Western illusions, then potential ways to bridge the differences, and wraps up with a conclusion.
That's the structure, a clear path through his argument.
Okay, let's dive into those Western illusions first. He starts with civilization and progress. What's the core idea there?
Guenon basically argues that the way the modern West thinks about both civilization and progress is pretty unique in history and actually quite recent.
Recent. How so?
Well, he sees Western civilization as having developed almost exclusively along material lines. Lots of technological and industrial advancement, sure. But he argues this came at a cost, a kind of intellectual regress, actually.
Wow, okay. Material gain, intellectual loss. That definitely cuts against the usual narrative.
It does. He contends that this intense focus on, practical stuff, industry, making things work, has shaped our intelligence. We got really good at the how, the mechanics, the techniques.
But maybe lost sight of the why.
Precisely. The deeper principles, the ultimate meaning. He kind of points fingers gently at figures like Bacon and Descartes, suggesting their emphasis on the empirical, the rational, maybe nudge things in this direction, away from maybe a deeper kind of knowing.
Okay, so a shift in focus. What about the idea of progress itself? That things are always getting better?
Yeah, he flags that as a particularly modern Western concept.
Yeah.
Really taking hold around the 18th century, he thinks, especially with the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Before that, history wasn't necessarily seen as this inevitable upward climb.
Civilizations rose, they fell. It wasn't assumed improvement was baked in.
Right. And Guenon is deeply skeptical of the Western assumption that its path represents the superior form of civilization. He'd say, sure, we have gadgets, but look at the decline in what he calls pure intellect.
Pure intellect. What does he mean by that exactly? Is it just being smart?
It's more than just logic or reason. It's almost like a deeper intuitive grasp of first principles, a direct understanding of, truth. He suggests we've traded quality for quantity, in a sense.
Quantity of stuff, maybe, over quality of understanding.
That's the idea. He even brings up Pascal, who apparently noted way back that continuous progress isn't a given. Past cultures might have actually been way ahead of us in certain, perhaps more fundamental areas.
So the focus just shifted, not necessarily improved overall.
Exactly. And related to this, he mentions a rise in sentimentality, feelings, social concerns taking precedence.
How does that fit in?
Guénon sees this moralism, as he calls it, sometimes acting as a kind of stand-in for real intellectual depth, prioritizing feeling good or social action, which is fine in itself, but maybe it distracts from grappling with the tougher, fundamental questions about reality.
Right. Feeling passionately isn't the same as deep understanding. Okay, illusion number 2, the superstition of science. That sounds like it could ruffle some feathers.
Oh, definitely. It's a core part of his critique. He argues the West treats science almost like a religion, the ultimate source of truth. Anything else, metaphysics, traditional wisdom, spiritual knowledge, gets sidelined or dismissed.
You hear that even today, right? If it's not scientific, it's often just waved away.
Precisely. The word scientific gets used almost like a magic wand to give things authority. But Guénon argues this reliance solely on what can be measured or empirically tested. Well, it drastically narrows our view of reality.
It closes doors to other ways of knowing.
That's his point. It limits what he calls genuine intellectuality. He acknowledges Western science is powerful in its domain, the material world, but he thinks it often operates without grasping the first principles underlying everything.
And it gets very specialized, too.
Yes, that too. People become experts on tiny slices of reality, maybe losing the bigger picture, the interconnectedness of it all, like studying one leaf incredibly closely but forgetting about the forest or even the tree.
That's a good analogy. And he also mentions a kind of blind faith that science will eventually solve everything.
Yeah, this almost dogmatic belief that, just give science enough time and all human problems will disappear. He sees this as an uncounted faith, especially since progress often creates its own new problems.
Okay, that leads into the next illusion, the superstition of life. What's that about?
Here, Guénon argues the modern West puts an almost obsessive value on physical life, just this temporary existence. There's this overwhelming fear of death.
Which contrasts with other traditions.
Starkly, yes. Many Eastern traditions, for example, place much more emphasis on spiritual realities, things that, transcend the physical body and this one lifetime.
So a different idea of what's ultimately important.
Right. And Guénon suggests this Western focus on just preserving physical life leads to prioritizing comfort, material stuff, avoiding suffering at all costs.
Which might actually get in the way of spiritual growth.
That's his thinking. Because many traditions see value in detachment, in recognizing impermanence, maybe even in certain kinds of suffering or sacrifice as paths to deeper understanding, concepts the modern West often struggles with.
Yeah, detachment isn't exactly a core modern Western value.
Not typically, no. He thinks this fear of mortality makes it hard for Westerners to really grasp those ideas that are central to many Eastern paths.
Okay, last illusion for now. Imaginary terrors and real dangers. Sounds ominous.
It does. Guénon's point is a bit ironic. He says, despite all our material security, modern Westerners are plagued by imaginary terrors.
Like what? Anxiety?
Yes. Anxieties stemming from that materialistic worldview, a lack of deeper meaning or context, fear of the future, fear of consequences, but without a strong spiritual anchor. You kind of see that today maybe with anxieties about information overload, the feeling of fragility despite technology.
A fear rooted in only seeing the material world.
Kind of. And he contrasts these imaginary fears with what he calls real dangers that our pursuit of material progress has actually created.
Such as?
Things like social instability, that feeling of dissatisfaction bubbling under the surface, even with wealth, a lack of real intellectual or spiritual leadership. The pursuit of comfort hasn't necessarily brought deep happiness or security.
And how does this connect back to the East-West thing?
He argues the West tends to look at the East through its own lens, imposing its own values and categories, like trying to understand Buddhism purely in terms of psychology, for example.
Without trying to grasp it on its own terms.
Exactly, which leads to misunderstandings, failed connections. It's like expecting another culture's complex philosophy to fit neatly into Western boxes. It just doesn't work.
Right. Okay, so that covers the illusions. Now, Guénon moves on to how these massive differences might actually be bridged. He starts with fruitless attempts. What went wrong there, in his view?
Well, he thinks most attempts failed because they didn't grasp those fundamental differences we just talked about. Often, the West tries to sort of absorb or translate Eastern ideas into its own framework.
Like making it fit the Western model.
Yeah, instead of appreciating the Eastern tradition's own internal logic and principles, he even calls it a kind of intellectual colonialism, maybe implicitly assuming the Western way is the default or the superior one.
Trying to force a square peg into a round hole, intellectually speaking.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
He also criticizes the West's obsession with novelty, quick fixes, superficial changes. He says that mindset just isn't equipped to understand the timeless, deep principles often found in Eastern traditions. You can't just, adopt mindfulness for productivity and think you understand Buddhism.
No shortcuts to deep understanding.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
Which leads him to what would work. Agreement on principles. What kind of principles?
He means fundamental metaphysical principles. Core ideas about reality, existence, knowledge itself. He argues the West needs to see the limits of relying only on empirical data, on what you can see and measure.
So acknowledging other ways of knowing. Exactly. Recognizing that things like intellectual intuition, that direct grasp of truth we mentioned, and traditional wisdom have their own validity alongside science. The common ground has to be found at that really deep philosophical level, focusing on shared spiritual or metaphysical truths, not just surface-level cultural stuff.
Okay, finding common ground on the big questions. Then he brings up this idea of an elite. Who are they and what's their job?
Right, the constitution of the elite. This isn't about social status or money. It's an intellectual elite, a group of people within the West who could genuinely understand and articulate these traditional metaphysical principles.
People who could bridge the gap internally first.
Yes, individuals who could really get the deeper currents of both Eastern thought and potentially forgotten streams within Western tradition itself.
Like translators between worldviews.
That's a great way to think of it. Their role would be to interpret Eastern wisdom authentically in a way that makes sense to the West, but crucially, without watering it down or distorting it. He saw them as a potential counterforce to the purely materialistic, rationalistic trends.
A vital link for real understanding. Okay, and finally here, he stresses it's not fusion, but mutual understanding. Why is that distinction so important?
Because Guénon was strongly against just mashing traditions together, syncretism. He thought that would just create a confused mess, losing the unique value of each.
So don't try to create West-East blend.
Exactly. The goal isn't some bland hybrid, it's mutual understanding. Recognizing the validity of different paths, different ways of knowing reality, seeing how they might even be complementary, appreciating the distinct strengths of each.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Respecting the differences while seeking common ground on principles. So wrapping this all up, what are the main takeaways from Guénon's East and West for you?
I think the core is his stark highlighting of the different orientations. The West, in its modern form, focused intensely on the material, the practical linear progress. The East, traditionally, much more focused on metaphysics, intuition, a more timeless or cyclical view of reality.
And his prescription for bridging that gap.
It really hinges on the West, recognizing the limitations of its dominant modern worldview. It requires appreciating that traditional wisdom, particularly as preserved in the East, holds profound value. He insists real progress isn't just material. It has to include intellectual and spiritual understanding, a call for a much bigger perspective, really.
It's a powerful call, especially knowing it was written nearly a century ago. It definitely makes you wonder, how much does this analysis still hold water today? Are we still grappling with these same Western illusions?
That's the question, isn't it? How far have we come, or not come, in achieving that kind of mutual understanding he envisioned? What would it even look like in our hyper-connected, yet often superficial global landscape?
Profound questions indeed. It certainly gives you a lot to chew on about how we engage with different ways of thinking and knowing.
Absolutely. It's a book that definitely stays with you.
Well, this has been fascinating, a really deep dive into Guénon's thought. Thanks for walking us through it.
My pleasure. It's always stimulating to revisit Guénon.
For sure. And for you listening, we hope this sparks some thought. Maybe you'll want to explore Guénon's work more, or just reflect on these East-West dynamics in our world today. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time.